In today's episode, we discuss where games like Pugmire shine, gushing about the Shadowfell, and achieving monstrous storytelling. This is the DM Shower Thoughts. Welcome back. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts, the show we talk about our shower thoughts in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop scenarios, how to become your best self through gaming. My name is Adamus.
I'm John.
And I'm Ian.
And welcome back, gentlemen. So, I'm going to dive right in. I think a lot of our shower thoughts are actually going to blend in with each other. We might have a few tangents here and there, but we'll get to it. Now, I had the opportunity to run a game that I haven't run for some time. And the first time I ran it, it was really fun, really successful with a number of players. And that is a game called Pugmire. And really brief intro about Pugmire. Pugmire uses, I look at it like it's D&D basic. Like we have, it uses a lot of the 5th edition SRD rule set and then adds on a lot of really amazing lore and extra mechanical switcheroos that fit inside the world. And the world being Pugmire, where it looks adorable. You get to run around as dogs and cats and fight evils and monstrosities and all that jazz. And the players love playing as their pets. So they'll make anthropomorphic versions of their pets. And then they get to be Ditto and Tommy and Nellie and all their little pets that are actually in their houses. And they love that. So that's kind of how the players like to play it. And so they can kind of give in to those little things of, I'm skittish and this is how I react to this, even though I can speak English. But the idea behind Pugmire is that it's sort of deceptive. It's a post-apocalyptic world. We're gone. The man is dead. And we and the uplifted animals, the animals that man uplifted, so they now are the new people, dogs and cats, rats, badgers, and I think lizards are the other ones. Birds as well, are all uplifted and they communicate with each other. They're like, what happened to man? I don't know. But the dogs worship man as the master. So there's like the code of man, which is be a good dog. And it's sort of punny, but also has these extra layers of mystery and secrecy. And it's that secrecy that I sort of delved into in the second round of it. Using Roll20 as a means to storytell, I did a lot more lore dropping and a lot more world building in the world of Pugmire. And we also incorporated the side game, which is Monarchies of Mao, which is all the cats. The cats have some of the similar classes as the dogs, but they also have their own that are only theirs. So if you want to be like a monk type, that's a wanderer, and only the cats have access to that.
Are there any that only the dogs have access to?
The dogs, I think, only have access to the barbarian, the stray. And I wonder if Onyx Path Publishing is going to do more branches like that in the future, or they'll open it up that everybody can do everything, or we homebrew it so that everybody can do everything. It's a lot of the abilities are similar, but the language is a bit different. So you can play Monarchies of Mao on its own, you can play Pugmire on its own, but it has enough fluency to join. And that's what we did this time. We did a lot more of the intense combat against, in this case, they're called possessed cats and dogs, but they're affected by the unseen. Play on when cats and dogs like bark or run away from the things you can't see. Like, what are you barking at? It's the unseen. It's the demons that we think are responsible for the death of man. And in providing that storytelling experience, it almost broke Pugmire in the Roll20 setting. And it's like it got too serious for this game. And I think when working with players and then listening to people who do podcasts of playing Pugmire, they might run into like kind of grisly things. Like there are necromancers in this world. There are like zombie dogs and, hellhounds and, can be scary stuff. But at its core, it's a bunch of dogs having fun. or it's a bunch of cats having fun.
Yeah,
And
well,
it's
I
a
mean,
lot
like,
more, sorry, it's a lot more shenanigans
yeah,
based, where things can get kind of silly almost, and that's celebrated and supported by the system. Whereas that way, when it is serious, it can be a nice break from all that shenaniganness. But because we've only had 2 sessions so far, the third one, I'm going to go back to that more silly area, because that's where Pugmire shines. It's really like it's an 80-20 of
yeah,
80% shenanigans and social interaction, exploration, and like silly-ish fun, because you're dogs and cats and they can be silly. And then 20% that dark, mysterious world. And it's like I put too much D&D into my Pugmire game. Go
yeah.
ahead,
Well, and
John.
it also like it depends on how you frame it too, I guess. Because like I just remember living at my parents' house, and they had a German Shepherd who, like, they'd go into the woods to go to the bathroom and stuff. And there was one time she propped back a rotted deer leg, which is a grisly, gory, gross thing.
Yeah,
But at the time, it was more like like it wasn't like a oh my goodness, it's like So it like
yeah,
you can have gore and grisly, but to a dog it's like, oh, a new smell to roll in. So like I,
yeah,
I guess it's how you frame it. If it's the darkness of man is gone and our religion is collapsing, or something dramatic like that, it's you present a grisly thing, but how do the players react to it, especially if they're deep diving into the mindset of their own pets. A cat that found a mouse isn't going to be like, oh, disgusting, like
oh yeah,
it's
no,
a fascinating study of how, as the DM, you can like curb an experience like that. You know what I mean?
oh yeah. And when we framed it, it was really cool to notice that what happened was we had more intense combat
Yeah.
in a space where really the pillars of play that are well supported by Pugmire are social interaction and exploration. Even in the book,
Yep.
it says, like, you can kind of fudge combat. Like, it's not,
Yeah.
this isn't about combat, but there's combat. But like, even when you build your characters, it's so much more rooted in their personality and the type of dog that they are and what do they look like, and really delving into those details of, how do they behave, and what are their different traits, and what are their squirrel moments, and really leaning hard into that. And that's where the joy of the game comes out. And I had crafted a more intense set of battles that had higher stakes, like personal stakes of like trying to defend each other, which is a moment of intensity. But I think at the onset isn't what these players really signed into for this second round of playing the game. So I've been already scheduled to play a third round of the game, and I've even put it out there, hey, I got the feeling that we wanted a little bit more of a lighter fare, so I'm going to do a lighter fare next time. And they went, great, awesome, that sounds awesome. And they're ready to go. But more of a return to form from the first time we played, which was very light, which was just, it was an interesting thing to take a note of, about where it's appropriate to have those deep or intense combats. And some games lend themselves better to that kind of format than others. And I think Pugmire has this sense of light and joy to it, even though it's a post-apocalyptic setting. That's sort of kind of the joke. You're playing around as dogs, even though, oh yeah, all the humans are dead. Anyway, look, fetch. It's fun.
To me, that kind of speaks to the value of when you're designing your encounters and stuff. Like, you don't always need a combat session or a combat scenario every session, because the I would say that the combat, the feel of combat usually gets enhanced by how well your exploration and social interaction has been going. And I think that's something that you can learn really well from Team Tree, for example, in Gray Owls, where they are mostly social interaction, and it's very, secrety, and and intriguing and things like that, but they barely have any combat. But when they do have the combat, I bet it's like really good, really exciting, because it's like finally we get to use these tools that we barely ever use anyway, and it makes that feel much more valuable.
Yeah, and one last thing on this is having like, because my wife Julia is a dog person, right? Got Clifford the big red dog in my background,
Oh, yeah.
but she made me buy Pugmire for her, and we haven't even played it yet.
I'll
But
run
it
it for you.
basically, well, yeah, we just haven't had we haven't figured out the scheduling yet. But it flipping through the system, and really it is based off of the open game license from 5th edition. Like mechanically as a way to translate it for listeners that might not like really like that need some kind of like statistical translation. Like you can't even really build characters above D&D like 9th level. Like if you play a caster in Pugmire, the highest level spells that you can get is 5th.
Yeah.
So you don't get more than like a greater restoration or a flame strike. That's like where your character caps out. And there are even things like when I was looking at making my first Pugmire character, I wanted to make a pug, and like a bard isn't a spellcaster in the same way that a D&D spellcaster is.
Mhm.
They can support their allies, but they don't have like magical healing or vicious mockery or any of the D&D bard stuff. So you're right, it is just a very different system, and it's not about combat progression. It's about removing the higher levels of play in order to have a lighter experience, like you said. And it's really interesting in how, as a designer, as a dungeon master, how that frame can help you craft the experience that you want, which is I think it's gonna segue into Shadowfell.
Yeah.
But like for me, for Geras, you notice I'm not leveling you guys up every session.
No.
I'm like trying to really curate what levels you guys are at, because I want you powerful enough to do stuff, but not so powerful that you feel invincible, or so powerful that any trap or twist is going to be trivialized by just, oh yeah, I use this 6th level spell and the problem is solved, So yeah, and one of the most poignant things I've really considered was something XP to level 3 said. Jacob said it was D&D 5th edition doesn't scale well. So it doesn't mean that you can't have fun or it's not balanced, but it means that if you have 2 level 20 characters, depending on little build choices, you could have wildly different results. Where like you have one character that's very overpowered for their level, another character that's very underpowered, which is another reason why CRs are so unreliable in terms of measuring the difficulty of a creature, is because you could have a level 3 character that just destroys them one-on-one. You have another level 3 character that they need 4 party members to help. So it's just something to keep in mind in terms of, because the games run similar systems, there's a lot of design lessons you can take away from it.
And there's an element here of it's so interesting to look at the theology of playing Pugmire and then switching right over the next day to playing Shadowfell, which I'm about to jump into. And there's a through line here, which is that restriction breeds creativity. We said this before. And when we think about this just on a deeper level, it isn't that your combat prowess is restricted in Pugmire, but what is there? Like you can't pass a dog past level 10. There's been some extra third-party publishing that it's like, oh yeah, well, we can get ourselves to 20, and they kind of added in some extra rules. But right in the core rulebook, that's not the focus on the game. It's so much more about the exploration and the interaction character to character, and in telling this story with each other as you navigate the world. But it makes combat rarer, and it makes it less intense often, but it also makes it more valuable when it does happen. But it also encourages you to circumvent problems differently. You don't have to fight. You can try to talk to this thing, or I light a torch and I throw it over there and I distract it because I'm trying to be a good dog. I'm not trying to hurt everything. I want to be a good dog. And that sort of mentality, it almost breeds this idea. I don't have players when they play Pugmire that are obsessed with their numbers. They're not obsessed with their bonuses. They're not obsessed with, I do this much damage and it's amazing. And they don't argue about any of those hyper quantifiable elements. And even in the core book, it says you can move through those and you can kind of roll with it, and they can make a lot of circumstantial rulings, and that's okay. And really giving the GM freedom to do that. Because so many times, sometimes when you're looking at a new system, players can feel like restricted with how mechanically complicated or how mechanically synergistic they need to be in order to be effective. And in Pugmire, you can be effective being a mutt, random artisan, and all that jazz. And you still have choice points. But to go back to what John was saying about how you don't level up past a certain point and you don't have like these high level spells, that also it's supported by the world, that magic is low because magic is what is left behind by man. And it kind of lends credence to, you could have this amazing homebrew, which I built into the world, where you could find a 6th level spell, but it's like your capstone. It's the thing that you find after your 10th level. You discover a scroll for this amazing spell of something left behind by man. But it doesn't break the upper limit. It's just a thing that it says that there might be more, but no one, that's the other thing. It's a mystery. No one else knows the magic. Because no one knows. There isn't a school of 6th and 7th and 8th and 9th level spells because it doesn't exist. No one knows. So what you have is what everybody has learned over time. And there's a lot of mystery in Pugmire. So it lets you explore it, and it also gives the GM a bit more freedom, I think, to drip out that content because we don't know. Whereas in 5th edition, we can do that. We can restrict and then drip out that elements, like really restricting our spell casting, so there's a discovery element to it. There's ways to do that. But with Pugmire, you start there, and you can build up from it if you want, or leave it at that mystery. Whereas in 5th edition, you start with everyone knows that there are 9th level spells, and these are the names of them, and you have to scale back in order to breed that restriction and breed that creativity. Yeah,
so just to go back a little bit on what you said about 5th edition D&D, like how there are players that feel the need to, for lack of a better term, optimize their characters. Like they get obsessed with their bonus and trying to squeeze every number out of the thing they want to be good at. That mentality, I from having experienced it myself, is bred from encounters that are too tightly like or like too hard, you know what I mean? So the thing being, like, I remember playing my first D&D character and being like, this is my chance to shine, I rolled a hit, nope, I didn't hit again. And you have like a 10% hit rate, and then when you hit, it doesn't even matter because the creature is resistant to whatever your weapon's damage is. You know, so it's when you have a bounded accuracy model instead of a treadmill model like Pathfinder. I have a feeling, like, based on what you've been saying, Pugmire has even more of a bounded accuracy model, where there's not as many ways to increase your mechanical bonuses. Because like you said, that's not the point. But it also means that the more, as a designer again, that you create really hard encounters, kind of like Dark Souls, where the level of challenge increases too steeply over time, the more your players are going to get in the mode of feeling like they have to be mechanically sound in order to be successful. Yeah. So it's the more breathing room you give it on either side, the more chance you have for your monster to fail certain things, then the more players are going to feel free to try different stuff, because it's not like, I have the option that will work and the option that won't. So, and I think that really it comes to that, like you were saying earlier about, like feeling a lack of resistance and a lack of flow. I don't know if we've talked about it on the podcast yet, but there's an actual graph in game design of flow, where there's one axis that's challenge and one axis that's time. And really you're trying to find the optimal curve for your table of where, in what time do you increase the amount of challenge or the amount of skill required. If it's too little increase of challenge, like over an area of time, the experience is boring. Like there's not enough going on. But if it's too steep a curve, which I'll get into when it's my turn, then it becomes frustrating, you know, where it's like things got too hard too quick. It's like that's the feeling you get. And then the feeling of flow when there's the right amount of engagement over the right amount of times that you feel like you've had a fair chance to learn this. And that's why games like Dark Souls, which is like really known for being difficult, the community that it fosters is specific, because that's what they're looking for is a steep challenge over a small period of time. They don't want to feel like they're handheld. And then you get the opposite side of the spectrum where my sister and I are talking about the newest Pokemon games, and they hold your hand even up until the Elite Four. They're like, hey, do you want me to just heal your Pokemon for free? They look kind of tired. And you're like, no, I can be responsible for my own electric mouse. Don't you tell me how to raise my kids. Like, it's like, so it is funny, like, especially when you're considering something like Pugmire, in terms of the game challenge, is that what the players are there for? Or are they looking for a relaxing Pokemon experience? Mm-hmm. In D&D, maybe even D&D isn't the right system. Maybe they want Pathfinder because it's that Dark Souls community of I want to make sure, you know, I've got an optimized build.
Yeah. The last thing here is I just finished editing episode 90 now. It's in audio form, and we started in it talking about actually maybe it was 89 that we ended with talking about puzzles, and Ian brought up, hey, how do you craft a good puzzle, that might have been 90, but as we get into it also brings up, John, you had a really good point of there's battle, that combat is also a puzzle. And when it comes to Pugmire, this is a situational exploration puzzle versus a battle puzzle. And I'm sure there are better terms I can think of here if I really take some time. But really, like, I imagine a classic battle in Pugmire is, you know, dogs are on the main plains, and they run into an amalgamate, which is like dogs that are like a two-headed dog, a mutant dog. It's essentially the equivalent of running into a hill giant. And they like surround it, and they don't fight it because it's a dog. But what they do is they take nets out and they try to like trip it, or they try to like disarm it, or some of them try to talk it down, and one of them gets hit and it gets hurled across like a ravine, and now they got to deal with the water as it's pulling the other dog out, and they're trying to save the other dog and also deal with this threat. And maybe we can lure him over to the water, and that's the solution that we take. And it's less about I go toe to toe with the hill giant and then we kill it, and I need to make sure that my numbers are correct so that I can kill it. It's how do we as a party think about circumventing this problem. And that adds in one more mechanical change that's really team-based with Pugmire that I forgot about, and I didn't translate it into Roll20 at this second experience, which I think would have changed I think it would change the whole atmosphere, which is in initiative. Pugmire, whoever wins the initiative roll, they go first, and then they choose who goes next. And that includes the enemies. So, like, you could go first, John, and then you choose, you know what, I think it's most advantageous that the enemies go now, and then we go after. And then the enemies go, the guide, the GM goes, and then I would decide who's next. And we have little tokens we're supposed to flip over, or like some indicator that says we've gone, because you can only select someone who hasn't gone yet. And it ensures that there's a different flow to combat every round. And there's a lot more. When we did that the first time, there's a huge level of team building. You're not competing with each other. you're trying to get to the first of the line. And even if you're not the first of the line, you could spend fortune, which is like their form of inspiration, but you can collect it in a pool, and it's a collective party pool. So you can spend fortune to re-roll things, to interrupt initiative, to automatically succeed if you can justify it with story reasons. Like, there's a lot more flow to that, and a lot more dynamic teamwork that is supported by the system for you to make creative choices about who goes where and what they do, so that you can have the most, the best experience. But it's less about I go before you, so I hold my turn, and that's also a separation from D&D and Pugmire. It's a very freeing thing to then go, I think you should go next because you've got something you want to do, and whereas opposed you have to wait for that person. And that's an interesting way to also have it already be in the rules that that's how they deal with initiative. But in that sort of restriction and that sort of looking at things, and speaking of team dynamics, what's up, Ian?
No, it's just so funny. I was just going to comment that I think that's a really interesting point, that you can change something so core to D&D with these third party games, such as initiative orders, and still make it work really well. I think that speaks to like the fluidity of D&D and how much you can adapt it depending on your party or your campaign's needs, or what you just want to do as a homebrew world and stuff. I think it's interesting because it just shows that whatever you choose isn't going to be like better or worse necessarily, unless it's like totally broken. But it's not going to be better or worse than 5e. It's just different, and it's a choice that you can make if you want, because you feel like this sounds cool and I want to try it. So I just thought that that's a really interesting thing to think about, like how I was actually thinking about on one of the live streams earlier about passive checks and what kind of passive checks we never really use because maybe they're obsolete or maybe we just don't use them. I was actually thinking about a passive initiative score instead of rolling for it, but at the same time, what is that bringing to the game and what is that taking away from it? Do my players want to roll every time, or is this like I was thinking in a dungeon crawl where you might have a lot of small encounters all the time, so maybe a passive initiative is fine. So that was just my 2 cents on it.
Now this also brings into like expectations of a campaign, and I think with Pugmire there was such a long amount of time since the first one and then the second one. A lot has changed in just our lives and in our skills and in our setting since the first one. And I've had a lot more session zeros since the Pugmire one shot before the second one. And in that time, even for one shots, I'll do almost like a session zero or a character build so that we know what the world is and we understand the themings of it and the tone. And it's like we forgot all of that to play this second round of Pugmire. Yeah, we ran into little tone shifts and little issues that went, oh, we really should have established that. Whereas Shadowfell, this is the young adult campaign that's been going for a bit now, just finished their Act 1. And I phrase it like that. They just leveled up to level 7, and a few really big things happened in this last session that was an emotional roller coaster, but highly satisfying and had no form of resistance to what was going on. Everybody played off of each other remarkably well. They had rapt attention, even though they at this point had split to one group took care of one thing and one group took care of the other simultaneously, and then they met back. And they were they've always been really good about, it's not my turn right now, I'm going to watch this. This is the same one that's like, I put in a beat of chaos and I let it go and see what happens. And they love that kind of stuff. And with this, the restrictions in the Shadowfell campaign is, I told them this is a gritty world. You won't be rich You know, you're gonna have to fight for the money that you get, and you won't get a bunch of magic items. The magic items you get will be few and far between. Sometimes they'll break because they'll be like the off versions of them. So it'll be like a one-time use death ward instead of a periactive wound closure forever. You know, it's going to be something that you got to save these things. You got to use them smartly. You don't just waste them willy-nilly. And they loved that because it allowed them to, we have to be careful with this. We have to plan. We have to be smart about the items that we use and how we approach situations. And this is where they get encounters that might be above their level in terms of going toe to toe, but not above their intelligence to circumvent. And they do amazing with it, with the challenges I presented to them. But they are back in their hometown, their starting town of Glaurim, and Glaurim is dark Shadowfell space, and they return. It's under martial law by the Valkyries of the Evernight, because somebody, one of the players, started a rumor about one of the nobles, and as a slight uprising began off screen, that noble called in the Valkyries of the Evernight to then protect the noble family, because that's their job. So they put the city under martial law. So the heroes return, and they're already under scrutiny, and they're trying their best to get the heck out of Dodge. So they have been investing in a boat that is regenerative. It heals itself. It's a legendary vessel that one of the other characters was connected to. And so they decided and have been able to take ownership away from one of the nobles in the city on the ship. So they now own majority of the ship. And all the while they're doing that, they're being spied on by someone else. So they split up their groups. We've got two tieflings, a ranger and a rogue, brothers, and then a sorcerer, shadow sorcerer. And they started the campaign kind of together. So they're like easy team to work with. So they're like, okay, we're going to stay behind here, guys. You go talk to the noble. And what was so cool, they did a split up, and that trio immediately just fell right into a stealth mission. They didn't argue with each other about anything. They said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. Okay, well, maybe this is the best choice. Okay, cool. All right. And they listened to each other's ideas. There's a clutch moment where someone used a minor illusion to distract a guard, and it worked beautifully. It just was I use minor illusion to put that there. Oh, and he goes over there, and it flowed. And they ran into another party stealing from a ship. And there was a point where they could have done the silly thing. And in the past, this group would have done the silly thing, which is, there was a point where the invisible tiefling was about to be discovered. And you've got two assailants, possible combatants, stealing stuff across a storage area in a ship. And the tiefling's at the stairs, starting to go back up, like, I got to get out of here. I've been listening too long, time to go. They hear him just a little bit. He bumps a barrel. And the rogue from the enemies throws a dagger, and it smacks into the board above him and then disappears in a cloud of smoke and goes back to her hand. And I asked him, do you run through the door or do you stay still? And he went, I stay still, because he's still invisible, which was the smart thing to do, because the captain then drew a rapier that has a pistol on it and shot through the door, which is where he would have been if he went forward. Whereas past campaigns, they would have been, gotta go and run. And they might have been shot in the back at that time, or might have been at least attacked in that time. It would have been an attack roll instead of against a door. And in staying still, and even in the rest of the party staying still, even as the door was knocked off its frames, they avoided combat. And they got information, they got more information, and they were able to sneak out of there. They did an excellent stealth mission. And it's not like everything went their way. It's just they made intelligent choices. And in so doing that and kind of trusting each other, they came out okay, and with more information. On the other side, you have a player or character who has been serving a lord in the city, and then another character who is the captain of the ship, who is going to be the captain of the ship. And they are basically going to the lord to say, I own the ship now. You want to go in and be partners. And this is a high affront to this lord who is a vampire lord, and seems to battle with his monstrous side and his pride. And in so creating this window of, hey, I own the ship now. How about you and I become partners, and I'll be captain of the ship. The Lord, we had a persuasion roll, and we natural one. And I had a control roll, and I failed. So it became a very intense moment where the shadows in the room started to cling forward, and this lord begins to use psychic powers and like telekinetic abilities to overwhelm in this case, the paladin. I think actually, I think she might be a cleric of the party, who's the captain. And all the while, we had this great battle of mechanical rolls where they presented a good argument. Let's have another persuasion roll. Maybe we can talk our way down. That's a failure. So then it escalated. We have another possible choice point, and it starts getting harder and harder to do things from a mechanical standpoint. But we saw this great duel of, oh, we can try here. That's a failure. Well, you need to make a roll to see if he's going to hurt you. Okay, he's going to keep talking to you. You were successful here. Okay, you made a good argument. Make another roll. You fail. That's a natural one. Okay, we're going to present another argument. And I remember a time where John, early in our podcast career, like we try to make it so that if you fail, there's like a 3-step failure before you really fail, because it might take you down a notch, but that also creates more choice points. And as we started to have this battle of wits, almost, of the cleric saying, no, I won't, I'm not going to be owned by you. My life is my own. And really sticking to their morals, it was no longer mechanical. It was just, this is my deal, and this is how I'm going to do it. And then we had another character at this time was just watching this all happen, who then came forward and was like, no, you can't do that. And by bringing them in, it became a very intense situation where the Lord nearly hurt that servant, that other character. And in so doing that, it created almost a breaking point. So it became less about the roles and so much more about the relationship between those characters and what snapped in that relationship. So it ended with the Lord putting them both down, literally paying for the rest of the ship so that the captain can have the ship and have its full ownership. But he does so with the collected capital from the other character's debt. So the person who's been serving him for all this time, which frees her from his service. It also frees her from his protection and being able to throw his name around if she ever gets in trouble. That's now gone because she stood up to him. And it was a really interesting flow of seeing that relationship change and ebb and flow from the start of that conversation to the end. And it was scary, it was intense, and then it was satisfying, but also bittersweet, even though the end result was we had a character who is basically, I wouldn't say enslaved, but was serving this person, working off a debt, who is now relieved of that debt, no longer has to do that, is now free to be themselves and do whatever they want, but they no longer have the other benefits of being connected with that Lord. And in this world, that is a bittersweet thing. And so we have characters who are now wrestling with that and trying to mitigate between, well, I was almost, starting to care for this Lord, that maybe he's a good person, and then no, he's a monster. And there's a higher level of complexity there with the Shadowfell, because you might have people who act all right, but are also monsters. And what does that do to your whole structure? But they played it so well. And there was never a point where like a roll happened. They went, oh, please, can we have inspiration, please? There was no begging, nothing about that. They were just, ooh, okay, what's going to happen next? Or, oh my gosh, that was a success. Okay, what's going to happen next? And they were just there beat by beat the whole time. And it's so cool because there's a level of rapport and trust there that we've built up over, 3 campaigns. They trust me not to just, a rocks fall and everybody dies. And I trust them not to fight like little roles in this world. And it was so satisfying. It was a roller coaster. They ended the session all meeting back together at the tavern and then went, and I said, and that's where we'll close Act 1. And they just love that because a lot of things just changed. It raises a lot more questions, but also they have momentum. And there was clearly a turmoil thing that happened between all the characters. They learned a lot of things, and now they need to come back together and talk about it. And they were excited about the prospect of, okay, next session in character, we're going to talk about what we did. And that is so cool that they have committed completely to this sort of setting and the tone of the campaign, that they are so excited about simply talking to each other in character and playing and acting that way. That's the thing that they really looked forward to. And we just ran that session, and it was really cool. It was a bit slower, less intense, but it needed to be. We gave a lot of space for people to talk to one another and try to get a beat on, okay, what happened? You have bruises on your neck. What happened? Like there's a thing there. And there's a lot of layers to the social, the commentary inside the whole tone of the campaign and where the characters are going. But it's a powerful thing to see. And it's really cool to see also the maturity of these players as they've moved from campaign 1 now to campaign 3, and they've grown up playing together. So they're really comfortable playing off of each other in those more difficult things like social situations, where when you have a rotating cast of characters, that can sometimes be harder because there's a less of that comfort.
I think that this testimonial has, like, for me, I have 2 immediate big takeaways. First of which you already talked about, which is trust and expectations. Like, you remember, part of the reason there's this trust is because you created a session 0 with them. Basically, you were very upfront with what the tone was going to be, what the magic item economy was going to look like, and then you followed through on those expectations. That's what gets the trust, is when they expect one thing, you expect one thing, and that thing happens, you get more and more trust, which means you can do cooler and cooler things with so being freed from the fear of things going wrong because you guys are developing trust with each other. The other thing I thought was fascinating was the do you roll, do you not roll, and the element of luck in the spontaneous creation of storytelling, right? So I've even had players before be like, there are certain things I feel like my character should just be good at it. I don't have to roll. Like, they've said that to me as the DM, and I'm like, there might be more going on than I'm still going to have you roll because there is a consequence for failure. You may have a greater chance of success, but I'm not going to let you auto succeed on everything. Like, it's funny what each individual player's comfort level is with failure and success, and when they think that success should be automatically granted versus there being a chance that, even if they have the best intention or the best laid argument, that how that argument gets received on the other end of it, there may be failure. The person may not, based on the receiver's life experiences, may not be able to connect right away, even if you have, say, like a plus 11 to persuasion or something like that.
Yeah, that doesn't mean you automatically get away with everything. It just means certain things.
And at the same time, how do you respect a player's agency where it's like, it makes more sense to not have a role here, that there is that the role would actually add a mechanical obstacle to the flow of the conversation And you'll notice in my latest campaign, I don't really have you guys roll a whole lot. There's a lot of organic interaction I've noticed, and I've found that there are certain times where a roll is appropriate, but there's other times where if you just ask the question, I'm not going to be like, oh, roll persuasion to see if they answer you. Like, you don't have them roll on the things you want to encourage them to do. So like if they ask a question and you want them to ask questions, you don't create more obstacles to when they start engaging in the behavior that you're looking for. You know what I mean? So and that goes back to that flow diagram of if you add the more additional obstacles you add and the more degrees of failure, now you're discouraging certain behaviors from being sought out because there's that chance it might not go right, you know?
When it comes to the consequences of failure, I really like that you brought up that there might be other things going on, as it is with many arguments and choice points just in humans interacting with each other. We have to also be cognizant of another person's life experiences, even if we don't know them. And I like that in a way because of how this, especially that intense conversation came out. They started with a decent argument, and there was a chance that could have gone through. But also I had to roll to see if he would be offended because it hits on something in his past that has a distinct kind of knee-jerk reaction. That's he has life experiences. He has a lot of them because he's long-lived.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because a lot of times, you know, there's like a cool tool, and it works in D&D and it works in life, which is a lot of times this was a tool that was given to me by another martial artist. And when you start getting in your own head, or you start getting anxious about something, or you start getting really worked up, and you recognize that on a meditative level, like I'm getting worked up, whether it's justified or not, one way to kind of helps you springboard into that extra level of metacognition is, instead of saying I feel this way or why are they, you start by saying the story I'm telling myself is, and then that gives you the extra space of determining, you know, whether or not like it gives you the, I don't want to broader perspective, the broader perspective of considering all the players that are engaged in the action right now. So like when it's like, oh, well, that person's just wrong, and, you know, I know why I'm feeling, the story I'm telling myself is, and then you say the same words, how does that kind of change your perception of it? Yeah. The other thing I've been, especially with everything going on, when I no matter which debate I hear, because again, I'm not really invested in like no matter what the argument is, I'm not invested in the argument's delivery. I'm always trying to find the message. And really, even if someone doesn't say it right, I'm trying to figure out what their intent is, because I do believe that somebody can have good intentions. And the pathway to hell is paved with good intentions. Somebody can have good intentions, but misrepresent their intentions because of either their feeling of emotions or lack of training. The way they articulate their thought is not representative of what they're trying to say. And you get this on both sides, where somebody puts a tweet up wrong and they get blasted on all sides of it, and you know, we're in a very polarized climate right now. So the other thing I ask myself is, what in this person's experiences has incentivized them to feel this way? Yeah. You know, so no matter how controversial the issue is, if you ask yourself that, to me, and this is very personal, I'm not saying you have to do this or this is the way you should think about it. It just, for me, it lets empathy, even with people that I think are wrong. So even if I see someone on another side of a debate and and I feel like, you know, either you're wrong or you're, you know, actually your thoughts are kind of criminal, like, or what you're suggesting is going to bring about more damage than it is, you know, betterment or whatever. The thing I start by asking myself is, what in their experiences has incentivized them to act and speak this way? So, and it's sometimes it's an external thing, right? Like like they were raised a certain way. Sometimes it's an internal thing. They feel good when they speak this way. So, and it's probably they feel good because they're also not saying the story I'm telling myself is, and recognizing the narrative that they're getting wrapped up in, especially when it's somebody else's narrative that they're a part of. So it's, so I just found that's a very kind of personal character growth and development thing. But I found those two tools exceptionally useful in navigating the conversations that are extremely heated and a lot of times reductive. So it's a way to kind of pull it out to a broader perspective to help the most people and to be able to connect people that otherwise wouldn't be able to connect with each other, you know?
Yeah. And this does still tie back the success, I think, in Shadowfell, like where we really settled in, was sort of a culmination in that last session. But it also, at the end of that intense encounter, we had characters, like we had the cleric who was frustrated with, okay, I nearly just died, but I've got my ship, so that's all that matters. Let's just move on. And then we had the character who was ejected from their service and was given basically a parting package, a weapon, I think a silvered blade, which is very effective in the Shadowfell, very important to have that. And then like an amulet. And there's this weird point of that character kind of wrestling with, well, this person, cared for me and protected my parents and protected all these things, yet still nearly crushed my throat. Like, how do you reconcile that very complex relationship and sort of like a whiplash, where this lord at the end of this argument said, I'm still struggling with the human side of myself, not the monstrous. I'm still struggling with the human side, as he apologizes and then kicks them out. And it's just, there's a higher complexity there that it says, you could say he's just an evil monster, or everybody has these kind of threads. And I realize now when I made Lord Bairn, which is this character, it has a very Castlevania vibe, that there's a human side almost to him in how he considers other people. And there are other vampire lords that look at him like, oh, you're weak, what are you doing? But he will keep people alive as opposed to just killing them, because there's an opportunity for that. And that complexity has also breeded relationships and connections with his servants, or with the people he protects or sets aside. There might be a stronger connection there to his humanity, but he's still a vampire. And that gray is also what a lot of these players have been sort of fighting toward, is as showing what their desires are to play. They have been wanting to play a more mature setting, a less black and white hero story, and a very gray looking at things, so you can look at it from viewpoints and experiences. So you have different paradigms, but it's never, he's just evil. Yeah, you're in the Shadowfell, and there are monsters in the Shadowfell, but there are still also creatures that are kind of in the middle and will make choices that can be cruel and monstrous and terrible, but might also have other benefits or objectives. And that sort of looking at things is really exciting, to see also them navigating it, and not just navigating it like, I don't know what's going on, going, okay, and seeing where the lines are and where they blur is really fun to see.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because this is a story that humanity has been telling itself for like who knows how long. The conflict between humans and monsters, people and monsters. You see it in Castlevania, of course. You also see it in Hellsing, Hellsing Ultimate specifically, I would say, which is an anime that depicts Alucard as more human than the people that he's fighting against sometimes. And I think it's really interesting that you bring that up, that he's struggling with the human side, because the human side is what causes his suffering, not the monster side. The monster side takes it away. And I think that that's an interesting perspective and way to explore this story in a way that maybe not everyone always acknowledges when it comes to monsters versus people.
Especially in the
And,
Shadowfell, like it's easy
oh
to be
yeah,
the monster in the Shadowfell. It's harder to be the
yeah.
human in the Shadowfell. Sorry, continue.
And how does
No, you're right.
how does their experience incentivize their behavior?
Yeah, exactly. Like, what do you want them to become as characters? Do you want them to turn into monsters ultimately, or to become more, cling to that human side because there's this morality that drives them? And both can make really good stories, honestly. You have, for like, in Old Norse mythology, you have the tale of Fafnir.
Mhm.
He was just a very greedy person, and ultimately that greed drove him to turn into a dragon, apparently, where he coveted his hoard, and he killed anyone who came near it. And ultimately he was slain by a hero named Sigurd. And it's just interesting because the story of Fafnir shows how you can turn into a monster, and like what happens to people who turn into monsters inside their own community, because this is more like a metaphor, you might say, for don't be too greedy. But even in his dragon state, he was still like, you could still talk to him, you could still reason with him, but he was always out for blood because he knew what he wanted and he wanted to keep it that way. And then ultimately at the end of the story, it's interesting, Fafnir's heart was eaten by the hero Sigurd, and he gained power from it. He gained this power to talk to animals, actually. So it's interesting. Like, if you just look at it as a metaphor, what does that represent? To me, it represents the, overcoming your monstrous nature with your human nature, but also incorporating in it and accepting it into your person. And that's just one way to look at it. But I always thought that story was really interesting, and I love the story of Castlevania and Hellsing. So I really love seeing it in all its forms.
To kind of go off of what Ian just said, in terms of our monstrous storytelling, it really does, first of all, the DM's perspective on how they want certain creatures to interact and creatures to be presented, that's going to have a huge impact on how the players are able to see them. I love both of them, first of all. So the kind of story that Ian was talking about with Fafnir, is when the monster is because of a human's behavior. So something like another example I can think of is a Wendigo, right? Where a man who has succumbed to cannibalism, maybe with either through circumstances that aren't of their choosing, or because of some other reason, the taboo act physically changes them, right? And also makes them monstrous. And then you have something like, a lot of times in vampire or lycanthrope lore, it's not the monstrous side is more circumstance. It's not because of their choosing, right? So as a vampire, it's a lot of vampire lore. You get bit by a vampire, you start to become a vampire, So how does that sort of change how people kind of view that, So if you're presenting a vampire character, is the vampirism a result of their behavior, or is it a condition that was inflicted on them? And a lot of times this can also lead back as a metaphor to like the nature versus nurture argument, So like, is somebody acting a certain way because of the environment they were born in? Again, how do their experiences incentivize their behavior? Or is it did they have everything, they were raised with all the correct techniques, they had a loving family and environment. Maybe there's something, chemically that's off, that's creating a certain behavior. Or maybe there's none of that, and they've just chosen a certain kind of behavior that, we would deem as evil. So it's that monstrous storytelling can have this amazing amount of depth, that if we're open to it, and this is one of the things that's coming up with D&D specifically, like the conversation surrounding D&D. There are some folks on Twitter trying to cancel D&D because and I will admit, it's even when I read it, the conflict between good and evil is way too simplistically presented, especially in the earlier products. Like the Queen of Air and Darkness is evil and bad and hatred. Titania is good and she likes life, so she is good. Like, that is way too simplistic a dynamic for my taste of fairies. So it is interesting, like you said, how we can find depth in these monstrous stories and what that ends up meaning to us, kind of when we're interacting with each other.
It's interesting when you talk about like how life affirming qualities are considered good, and death affirming qualities, or destruction, let's say, affirming qualities are considered evil. And in Norse mythology, again, you see that with these things that are called the Jotun, or the Jotnar. And they're the giants. They're like the chaotic giants. They destroy everything. They're storm giants. They're like mountain giants, whatever. Frost giants specifically are really typical. And they're seen as evil. And the gods, like Thor, fights the giants because he's trying to protect humanity. But like if you look at that, you really see that all of it is from humanity's perspective. Humanity doesn't want to die, so they consider these chaotic forces of nature, however necessary they might be in the natural world. They consider them evil because it's destructive to their society. And so that's something interesting too to take into consideration. That's the level of complexity that you can get when you pull yourself from the human perspective and say, what is the cosmic perspective even, in some ways. So I just think that that's one thing that we don't often consider, or at least in early D&D, it might be a representation of how stories have evolved to become more complex and more, what's the word? You can empathize with them more. You can feel what they're talking about, these characters, these gods, a lot easier. So yeah.
And the last thing on this, before I let Adam go, is the original thought behind this monstrous thing that I had was, there's a very cool story that you can tell in terms of combating your monstrosity versus leveraging your monstrosity. So my favorite vampire stories aren't the classic, there's a vampire in a castle that's, classically evil. My favorite is the vampire with the soul, where they acknowledge that they have a monstrous side, and they actually, to survive, need to commit monstrous acts, like consuming blood or flesh or whatever. But kind of like Angel, like from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where they have a metacognitive understanding of themselves, but also and it might be part of their arc is that they deny themselves their vampire side. Even in Castlevania, Dracula didn't drink blood, right? But on the other side of it, they learn how to leverage. So it's like, usually it comes to, my loved one has been kidnapped, time to turn into a vampire. Like, where they learn there are times where that monstrous side is appropriate, and violence is always on the table, even though it's not preferable, So it's that, and I've seen it too. I've seen it from my mentor. I've seen it from other very highly functioning human beings. There are times when the chips are down where violence is on the table, whether that be physical or it's like a very direct, you need to be fired, like a lifestyle violence, So it, violence isn't the answer until violence is the only answer. But that idea that you have this, I don't know if primal is the right word for it, because it's not always, there's a very evolved element to it, but how that monstrous side, or that violent side, for lack of a better term, can be leveraged as part of your identity of becoming a whole person. That instead of trying to deny, you know, certain like feelings that you might have or a skill set that you have, how to leverage that. I mean, as a martial artist, you come up with that every day, you know, like, you know, how to, you're literally training an art of how to hurt somebody. But through that development of power, you also develop compassion and empathy, you know? So our martial arts school is all about character growth and development and becoming your best self through your work, even though the skill set and the process that you're practicing is literally how to kill somebody if they try to kill you. So it is really interesting, you know, how do you reconcile that? Bruce Lee would say it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. You know, as a vampire, as somebody who can be skilled or has an ability set that makes them exceptional at violence, you know, is that, do you really want to rid yourself of that option when the chips are down?
With this character, I am heavily influenced, I think, by the work of Jim Butcher. Jim Butcher is the author of the Dresden Files, an excellent series about Harry Dresden, who is a wizard private investigator, essentially. And what starts, like, the first couple books are very much monster of the week, mystery, here we go. But then there's a book like book 5, I think, is maybe where he visits the fairy courts, and the world just explodes outward. You see the amazing level of world building that's now available to you. And he has a really smart look at the fairies of the world, a really smart look at the vampire courts. And there are courts of vampires. There are different kinds of vampires. And I was so influenced by that, because that immediately created these through line of gray with all of these things that go bump in the night. And yet there are things in the Dresden universe that are just bad. But the things that are just bad are like the Black Court vampires. The Black Court is like the very much undead. These are the creatures that do not restrain that monstrous side. And because of that, there are so few of them, because when they do their things, they're murdering people. So of course, the wizards and the crusaders and the holy warriors of the world go and they destroy them. So there's less of them. But then you have other courts. You have a white court and a red court, and some of these have societal functions. So they only feed when it's necessary, or they only feed in certain ways. And I added in 2 other courts, which is the blue court and the green court. And they have different philosophies about their survivability, essentially, and how they are supposed to reconcile that monstrous side of themselves. And I think instead of the Black Court, I called them the Night Court. But they're the monstrous ones. They're the ones that give in completely to all other creatures that have blood or food. You know, and in that, I was able to homebrew a lot of the Shadowfell. And then also, from influenced by Dresden, I have fairy courts. I run a Feywild campaign. And also, when you research the Shadowfell and the Feywild in Faerunian lore and in D&D Legacy lore, there are these pockets of information, but you don't have a concrete setting, really. There are some third-party publishings that did that, and they're there, but they are very much a person's take on it. And so I have been dedicating myself to creating the Ionian Shadowfell, the Ionian Feywild, and I have my own maps now, and my own cities, and you know how the structures all work. I have to lean into homebrew just because all I have is lore, but no concrete areas. Sometimes they'll reference cities. Sometimes they'll reference, oh yes, this exists, but we don't know where. We're not entirely sure of the geography. I've seen many different maps. Maybe there's a concrete Faerun map of the Shadowfell, but I don't know. I don't think there is, but there might be. Or it might be from, first edition, or like the Plains walking series of stuff. But I haven't found anything in my research, in my book research yet, that's really concrete and wasn't just a take on the Shadowfell, or a version of the Shadowfell. So I've been doing a lot more homebrew in that to work on into that world.
This actually just occurred to me, because I've also been interested in like your pursuit, like Feywild and Shadowfell. It might be because the name Feywild and Shadowfell was original to 4th edition.
Mm-hmm.
Beforehand, they were called the Plane of Shadow and the Plane of Fairies. So if actually, I'm curious, because that just occurred to me. If we look up that might have a much more detailed.
That might be.
It's kind of like you got to know what to search for, you know.
But I do like your point, Ian, that he just put in the chat that, the lack of info might be intentional, because in the same vein that I think there is a map of the Plane of Fire, but it's like a tiny region, and it's the city of Brass, and then you're surrounded by volcanoes and lava. It might be that the lack of info is intentional so that it can be whatever you want it to be. It's often that we don't have a campaign in Elysium. We don't often have a campaign in one of the other planes. We have a campaign in the material plane, and then you visit the Feywild, or you visit the Shadowfell, or these creatures are from the Shadowfell, and they're in the material plane. Oh no, these are places that creatures come from to you. You are not usually there, and I think that also it doesn't ground it as much. So I see that in our research and us figuring this out and having our sudden moments of thought, you search for a Plane of Fairy and you got a map immediately. But still, when I look at those maps, I go, I don't really want that. And even the maps I found, I go, I don't really like that. And so I've been spinning my own Shadowfell as well. And I think that it lends a lot of value in the discovery for my players too, when I give them, my own map of these are the cities, these are the things you have. And it also grounds it in my world. And I like that from the influences of the other pieces of literature that I've consumed, and the Iron Druid series as well is another good one, that the monsters that they have in their monstrous storytelling, the ones that are downright evil don't last long. It's the ones that, when we've said before, ancient creatures are ancient for a reason. There's a reason that these things are around. They're careful, they're intelligent, they know when to enact their violence, they know when not to. And the ones who are more practiced are older. The ones who are least practiced will get into trouble, they'll get into more fights, they'll risk themselves. And it's when you start playing monsters like that and characters like that, it adds another depth to storytelling that I find to be very, very energizing.
Yeah, so actually all this talk of fairies and courts and stuff, I think this is going to be a good bridge into it's probably going to be a combination of Ian and my shower thought. Yeah. So and you guys both played in it, so you're half of the party. So you can always jump in and tell me I'm wrong. But so I just ran my 3rd session in my latest campaign setting of Geras, which is a separate continent on my homeworld of Thelen, in a separate timeline. So it's a lot more like the aesthetic is a little more steampunk. I call it magic punk because it's like steampunk, but everything is powered more by magic. Yeah. And it's very, very based on Eberron. There's a lot of stuff I stole from Eberron or repurposed or reflavored or whatever. And the aesthetic is very like 1920s Manhattan, similar to The Legend of Korra, if you guys have watched that. Yeah. The battle music, and there's a lot of things I'm doing right in Geras, and it's taking me a while after the fact to recognize that there's not like some good things I'm doing. There's like a lot of things that's adding to the experience, things like the kind of artwork I'm showing. So you get a visual, and then jazz music is the audio. Like it's a very curated, very deliberately designed experience. And I think that's the biggest thing. But I wanted to come back kind of to the homebrew versus module dynamic that we talked about, because at the time we're recording this, episode 89 just dropped, which is the one where we really talked about module versus homebrew, any stigmas of running modules. And I do have fresh thoughts on that. But it's really interesting because I used to be like a module kind of dude. Like I used to run modules for a lot of reasons. The biggest one being I didn't feel I had time to prep. And one of the benefits of quarantine is it gave me time to prep. So and there was also a lot of, like, looking back on it, there was a lot of social pressures of me to run a lot of games, of me to run consistent games, and it wasn't an optimal flow for me to deliver the best experiences. So one of the compromises I made with my players was I can deliver high quality experiences, but I'm going to do them on my time, on my schedule. So we won't play until I'm ready to play. And, you know, that might mean that you only get one session a month. It might mean that you get 3. It all has to do depending, because we're in this very mercurial scheduling state where our state, Connecticut, is like, it's been handling COVID a lot better than a lot of other states, but we're slowly starting to reopen and everything. And there's certain, I don't know, there's certain schedules can get kind of wonky. Some people are going to be busier. Some people have bigger pockets of time. It might be that we have to go back into lockdown or half a lockdown. It might mean that things start opening a lot quicker. We don't quite know yet. So I'm just delivering the experiences at the pace I'm delivering them. And one of the things I explored in this last one that I was honestly really nervous to was the idea of the fairy courts. I thought the session was a smashing success, but you guys can tell me like parts of it that you liked or parts of it you found frustrating, because again, like this is the first time I've run a series of sessions that aren't based off of some kind of module or aren't based on some kind of prescribed lore. This is like besides the Eberron stuff I've cherry picked, like this is like the John world. So I'm gonna just kind of open it up to you guys, because I am curious on whatever feedback you have or what kind of stuff, you know. Go.
Okay. So immediately when you had started to propose this world to us on the setting, you had said, "Oh, I'm borrowing heavily from the format of Night Owls," and Night Owls has a distinct format. There's an overarching world. Each season has like a grand threat that sort of reveals itself maybe halfway through, and it's kind of a mission by mission basis. There might be some through lines and lore connections, but you don't have to attend one session and then to know what's going on in the next one. You're supposed to just kind of, you get either there are benefits to continuing, but you don't have to. So it's not a restriction to play. And you presented it like that, and I really appreciate that. However, what I'm starting to see evolve is you did such a great job with establishing, especially with your 10 questions, the roles and the backgrounds of the characters and their motivations, so that it slid into the world really well. And in making your own world, that helped ground it. So in this last session, though Fennec, I think, had actually I took a more of a step back in favor of watching another player really shine, because we were visiting their hometown, I think. And it was so cool, because instead of it feeling like a one-shot scenario inside this setting, it felt like the episode of a show, the episode of a comic. So this episode focuses on this person's hometown a little bit, and the rest of us are peripheral. We can react to this town, and we have our own perspectives, and we're allowed to have those, and then we continue onward. And to have also a conclusion from the first episode I was in with Tim and his buddies, and getting them resurrected in a way. And that ended with a lot of lore on your Feywild. And I appreciate that, but it also seemed to connect to one player in particular that had other knowledge that I don't. And that's great, because it made me as a player go, "Ooh, what's going on there?" And then made Fennec go, I gotta figure this out. And it's I thought it was thoroughly enjoyable, and it raised a lot more questions about curious questions about what Feywild are we working with? Because I think Titania was mentioned, and the Winter Knight might have been mentioned, which is, to me, it links directly to Dresden. And then all of my Feywild lore has knights that are all part of the various courts. Same thing with the vampire courts; they have knights. They might be called something different, but Queen Mab. They are Queen of Air and Darkness. So the Winter Knight, and it was just really cool to then be able to witness some of that and have it be, even though it was right at the end of the session, just to raise that question. And now knowing, okay, this might be a theme in what we go through in this campaign, or it's another thing that exists in the world. We might never see it again, but there it is. And I like droplets like that because it can pique our interest. So if it shows up again, we can explore it. If it doesn't, we could ask about it. And if it still doesn't, it was neat to see. And it might show up in another campaign later. It might show up in the future. Who knows? In a different setting. But now we have experienced a little bit more. And I think that's also one of the great values in homebrew. As you start to world build, you can trickle in little bits. We don't have to know everything right away. And in fact, by dripping in content, it allows you space to clarify it in the background. It allows you space to grow it slowly over time. You don't have to present to us, here is the book of the Feywild. Yeah. And now it's permanent. Like, you can drip in little tidbits and continue to fill it in and fill in the gaps through it.
I'm curious, have you read the short story for this one?
I've not yet.
Yeah, because actually, because our session ended at 1:30 in the morning, I kind of was like, these are the droplets, I'm done. But actually, I did go a little bit further into depth at the end of the short story, where some of the information was reorganized a little bit, so the narrative flowed a little bit better. But yeah, especially if you're interested in the lore droplets, there's just a little bit more at the end of that one.
I haven't read the story either, but so far what we've been doing with them is really refining the story that we've been telling and making it so it's more coherent. There's no continuity errors. So like in Roll20, it's very easy to do continuity errors because people type at different speeds and at different times. So you might say something and then it just completely gets abolished by the thing that gets said by the next person or something like that. And I think that the way you've been doing Geras has been very interesting because you're doing something that I would like to do, or that I enjoy doing when I get the chance to, which is incorporating characters from your PC's backstories and putting them into like the world so that you can actually go and talk to them if you wanted to, as opposed to just being like, they're in your past, not here anymore, they're not dead, but you don't ever see them, and that kind of thing. I think that's I think what you've been doing with that has been really good so far. I would say that as far as the entering the Titanwood there, I know that we kind of we were almost like at that part of the campaign, we were almost in a little bit of a concerned pace where we're trying to not end at 3 a.m. or something at the same time. But I do think that if we didn't have that kind of time constraint, then we would have been able to explore it more thoroughly to the point where it warranted the 17 pages that you wrote afterwards. I definitely think that that just shows how much in depth you've gone into this thought process of what the Feywild's like, what we know about fairies in general, especially in this post-war world where magic isn't as valuable anymore as science, like creating spell gems and things. So I think that's really good. And I would definitely be looking forward more to exploring the Feywild and the fairies and what they have to have to do, because that's my favorite thing about D&D is the Fae. I know it's actually your least favorite thing, at least as far as your characters go, and even you. Uh, so I actually have to give you props for that one, that you really pulled it off very well. So that was exciting to me.
All right. Well, now that I've been praised and I'm going to be showered in it. So one of the things we talked about in a few episodes ago was that we have this idea between modules and homebrew. And before I was really speaking up for one side of the argument, because, Adam, you've been doing homebrew for everything. So I wanted to make sure that the other side got properly represented by another point of view. The other thing is the few times I've really tried to run a lot of homebrew stuff, I did a poor job at executing it. And also my players didn't have the habits of being able to bring it to life. So, and that is partly on them. There are certain player habits that you can develop in order to create satisfying and immersive play. But it was also an experience on my part as a DM to train certain habits in them so that way they could yield the most powerful experience. It's kind of like, it's the difference between, watching like a sports game and having a commentator explain like everything that's going on, that if you have an untrained eye, you may not pick up on, or you may not know what you're watching. So to me, to give the other side of the argument a little bit of stuff, I have found that modules have their place. I think you can create extremely satisfying experiences with them, because I have in the past, especially with some of the one shots I ran, like Cursed Castle and like I did run Dragon Heist through. I ran Tyranny of Dragons through, even though there was some it wasn't exactly Tyranny of Dragons. But I do find that the primary thing, and Adam was really speaking to this with Shadowfell, is player trust. That really, to make the most out of a homebrew experience, you have to have a trusting relationship at the table. And even if it's people that you trust, you don't necessarily have player trust. So you may trust certain people as people, like you may come to them when you have a problem, or you might seek their advice if you have a conflict. But that doesn't mean you've developed player trust, where they really understand what your style of DMing is, or what you're going for, or what to even expect. To establish player trust, you have to be able to deliver on expectations, both for yourself and the other person, because trust is a two-way street. And this is where I was getting really caught up with, is I spent a lot of times trying to cater to my players that I wasn't tending to my own like needs and expectations as a DM. And looking back on it, a lot of every time I had a less than satisfying experience as a DM, including Monday Campaign 2, including Storm King's Thunder, it was because at some point the expectations shifted, and they were never really addressed in an appropriate way. So part of setting expectations, of course, is a session 0. As in terms of Gearas's development, really, I find Gearas has been successful because everybody's expectations and the player trust has been reinforced. And that doesn't necessarily mean I'm not hiding things from you guys, or there's no reveals, or there's no mysteries, but you can trust in the process of the experience, So, and this is where I think like Adam already spoke to it, Pugmire might have fell off, because if the players were expecting a comedic experience or a lighter experience and they got really tense combat, that didn't quite line up, But if I say I'm going to run a homebrew world with a lot of more complicated homebrew mechanics that may require more responsible bookkeeping from the player's end, and if you don't want that, you're welcome not to play. Now it brings the player to a choice point where, am I going to make the decision to step up, or is that not something I'm looking for right now out of my D&D experience? And I think it's fortunate that all the players really did step up. That even players that may have been spurned by that style of gameplay in the beginning of their playing career, they really they really like rose up to it, you know? So, and I think that expectations, there are a few factors that can really help a DM determine if a module or a homebrew experience is more appropriate. And that's really what we're coming to. There's not one that's better, but there certainly are times where a module is more appropriate than homebrew. And it all comes back to player trust and satisfying expectations. So the first thing being, and I think that these two things aren't talked about enough, numbers and scheduling. That if you have more than 4, I would go out so far as to say that a module will probably be a more appropriate experience. And the reason why is it's not about satisfying a story of a character that the player has created. With you can really look at a D&D character from one of 2 broad perspectives. And there's overlap, of course, but I found either that character, even if it has aspects of your personality, is a separate personality that you adopt and role play with that has their own story beginning, middle, and end. And that there are parts of them that may be like you, there may be parts that are unlike you, but it forces you to step into somebody else's shoes, and it really helps you create empathy, and there's a little bit of acting ability on it. The other kind of D&D character is where they're an avatar for you, that they're your nameless person in the game world that you control, kind of like Skyrim. And, you can make a story for them, but really they just end up being your point of interaction with the story. And you're not, they may have a name that's different from you, but they're really you. And I'm sure we've all had characters like that. And it's not about their story. It's about how you explore the world. And to me, homebrew is much more appropriate for the former. A module is much more appropriate for the latter. So, and a lot of times you can have, it may feel like a more shallow narrative experience, but it doesn't detract from the satisfaction you get from play if you set it up like that, So like a lot of times, like if I say, hey, I'm going to run Sunless Citadel, it's just a dungeon, bring a character you want of your build. You can still social interaction and everything, but it's not necessarily going to be the same in-depth narrative experience where you're speaking to NPCs from their backstory or delving into their motivations or their character's arc where they grow. It's much more like, oh, we go into the thing, we beat up the bad guy, we get some treasure, we're done. And if your players may not even be able, because especially if they're new players, may not be able to voice if they want one or the other. If you have a module where you don't feel protective or feel ownership over your own homebrew creation, it's going to be a lot easier to create a neutral environment where the player can help discover that preferred style for themselves. And I remember Stephanie and Ken talking about that, where they're like, we don't want an interesting backstory. We want the avatar approach, And I've learned through, especially because it's been highlighted through Roll20, I prefer the narrative approach where I create a character with an intricate backstory and stuff. And if you get those two styles of players next to each other, there can become a lot of friction within the table because you got some players that want to tell these in-depth narratives, and you get some players that really just want to have beer and pretzels D&D where they fight the monsters. So, and I think that's where Thursday's table really came to a schism, is you had half the table that just wanted to show up and fight the thing. You had half the table that wanted to explore the world and the lore, and nobody could really agree on when it was appropriate for the space. So that kind of...
We had a lot of difficulty reconciling that shift, and
it's because the table was inappropriate. Like it would just really what needed to happen was 2 separate games, one that was more kick down the door, one that was more story intensive. And again, how often does play into it too. I find that if you have a weekly game and you don't have the time to prep, a module is much easier to run. You read the book, like we talked about in episode 89. If you need to change certain things to make the encounter chain make more sense, or because your players, you need to change certain things, you have the freedom to do that, but it does take a lot of the creative pressure off of you, and it does make it much easier to run a series of games more efficiently, you know? So the number of players, how often, their styles, and once you can understand what everyone's expectations are, that's where the trust can build. Now, I do think that DMs should start with modules. That doesn't mean I think that they're like a beginner-only tool or they're like a training manual, but I do think that every DM really should start with Lost Minds of Phandelver, because it helps you build confidence as a DM. Even if your players are new or if your players are veteran, it has just enough guideline to make it so that you can learn intelligent decision making as a dungeon master. I do think that once you've developed rapport, trust, and expectations, that the level of depth into a game that you can do from a homebrew world is going to outshine a module. I think you're right. Modules do have this sort of restraint put on them that unless you're an extremely clever DM that adds homebrew content to them, which again, now we're going into homebrew anyway, that modules can become very limiting, and that there's a ceiling to how satisfying the play can get. But I do think that so to give the homebrew side a little more credit, I do think that having run a series of successful homebrew games, that to me, they're the most satisfying games I've run as a DM. I think that homebrew is really ends up being the way to go, but that doesn't mean you ignore your foundational practice. You know, a horse stance and a front punch isn't what you do to defend yourself in a fight, but it still creates the foundation that that gets you to understand your body, so that when you do get into a fight, or if you get into a fight, you know, you have that foundation to be effective, you know?
As I've been listening to you, it kind of dawned on me that there's been also a shift in our personal styles and exploration. So in the meat of all of this, when we really started getting into this, at least John and I, and me first, in doing DMing professionally, running games professionally, it was for a business. And when you have a business, every seat that you have, I mean, you're charging, there's a certain level of extra responsibility that comes from that, and quality assurance. You have like everything, you got to be on. You're ready to go. You never show up one week and go, guys, I didn't plan anything. You are always ready. And when I'm running, 8 campaigns a week. Yeah, I'm always ready. I walk in, I'm ready to go. It could be for 2 hours, for 3 hours, and maybe then we have the big events on Saturdays, sometimes Sundays as well. And those are 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 hours long. I was walking in and just running games. I got really skilled at, even if I only had a half-formed idea, I could turn it into an epic game. However, what that sort of shifts around as we became, and especially in recent times, have become a lot more skilled with our how we approach things and how we storytell and our level of preparation, now shifting more to Roll20, but also just taking the time. Now I've had the opportunity to take the time, and a lot of that business end has fallen only on me. So instead of having a team of GMs that are all putting butts in seats to come play, it's just me. And I had to shift out of that mentality of the more people I have to play, the better the business will do. And what did that actually sacrifice? If I was trying my hardest to be like, well, I can just make this a little adjustment in my own comfort to allow one more seat, and then the business does better. I can just make the party 8 people and the business will do better. Maybe I can make the party 10 people and the business will do better. Can I do that? Can I try to stretch that? Yeah, I can totally, yeah, I can do that. And how many sacrifices did I make in my own, development to just make the business do better? I'll just change this little thing. And the shift in mentality now is the business is me. And what better quality to a party of 4 where the experience is absolutely wonderful and amazing and has layers of depth we never thought possible, that is satisfying and hugely important and impactful in their lives, and satisfying and impactful from their gaming. Like, we could have 6 hours of amazing gameplay with 4 people and have mediocre role play and gameplay for over 10 hours with 15 people. And also, what does this do and how does it shift my own preparations? Because, yeah, for 3 years straight, I was pretty much running at least 4 games a week, maybe more, and having to be on all the time, put butts in seats, let's go. Now, that upgraded my level of preparation to a point where I can, even at my worst, I'm pretty good. But at my best, if I actually give myself time, real time, to go back in the cave and prep and tell my players, the people who have signed on to this as part of my tribe, of just, no, take your time, because now we've experienced what it's like when you take your time. And what does that do? So I think when we start addressing time, if you don't have a lot of time and you're pretty good, I'll go back to a module, sure. But if I have the time to really pour love and detail and creative thought into the session I want to build for my players, and now I have a working knowledge of those players, and those player groups have gotten smaller and more intimate, more connected, then I think I can provide a really powerful experience for all of them. But it's a shift in experience. It's a shift in perspective. I'm not thinking about it from a business side anymore, even though it's good business to provide a good experience. Like, as an entertainer, it's a good thing. It is a very, very good thing to provide an excellent experience. But the pressure to do so on a frequency side is less, and that frees me to provide a better experience when I do it. So I really appreciate John's perspective in me taking July off and him letting me know, like, only come back when you're ready. Like, you should run a thing when you're actually ready. So if you want to take more time, you can. And just having someone say that to me is just really good, because for the longest time, the story I told myself was, I can sacrifice my sleep, my health, my everything so that the business survives.
And
And
what does that end up doing to the overall quality of the experience? Would that
yeah,
actually, we're finding with the martial arts school, especially because of COVID regulations, like, you can't just let as many people you don't want that many butts in seats, because you have to keep everyone at a 6-foot distance.
mm-hmm.
So this gives us the opportunity to create a very clear message of if you want this out of your martial arts experience, we are the people that we can deliver that experience. If not, we may not be a good matchup, So if the optimal experience is to only have 4 people in a game, you have 4 people in a game, because the quality is going to be the thing that brings them back, because it's one thing to get a butt in a seat. It's another to get a butt in a seat from the same person, where you've developed that relationship. There were a few times I ran a one-shot module that was more the Avatar approach of, here's a dungeon, go explore the dungeon. I would have 1 or 2 people that would be new and they wouldn't come back. And I wonder how much of it was the experience. I wonder how much of that was their expectations. But again, part of it was because they wouldn't communicate for a session 0. And that was kind of on their end, where it's like, hey, we're gonna do this thing where we all get together and kind of discuss things. They opted out of that, so they didn't get what they wanted out of the experience. So a big part of that is the commitment on both ends.
Yeah.
A lot of times in DM shower thoughts, we focus on the DM's perspective, but the player's level of accountability and the player's level of skill, that is how you elevate a game from good to great,
Yeah.
So it's once your players make the decision to become responsible, and as the DM, there are little things we can do to highlight and to be able to clarify the choice point of, listen, if you want to play in Garrus, this is what I expect of you as a player. And if you don't follow through on your end, then to let you know the experience isn't going to be satisfying, and it's going to be your fault because you didn't follow through on your end. Like that has a different level of accountability than, oh, it's all right, I'll make it okay for you, you know?
Yeah.
So
And that
it is.
in trying to view it from that old perspective, I would let more things slide because I had a person, and I would say, like, I'm just going to roll with it. And I recognizing later with blog posts about, like, no, these are my boundaries. I'd really like it if you didn't do that, or I'd really like it if you did this instead, or these are my expectations at the table, because they came from time and time again of people coming in and expecting one experience or trying to abuse that experience, or coming in with this expectation and then not getting it, and then trying to force that expectation. It brings a lot more value to, like, you have your living document, I have my living document now of grays and all those things, and being able to put out there, this is what I expect of you at the table. And then if that doesn't fit a player and that player still wants to play with you, and there is an opportunity in the future of you having a table where you have the expectations that better align with them, of, hey, I'm going to make a cartoon table, and you can make a cartoon, and it's going to be silly and lots of circumstantial ruling. We're going to kind of be weird about that. Maybe that's the experience that they want to jump into. But by, again, pre-establishing those expectations, you ensure that the players that are actually going to commit to those expectations are going to come to the table. And if they don't, we know why, and we know why they're experiencing what they're experiencing, and they can leave. And that's not the table for them, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that the DM is bad. That doesn't mean the player is bad. It means that the expectations weren't aligned and we didn't follow through.
Yeah, and so to reflect just a little bit on some of the things you said. First, you can have boundaries and also, for lack of a better term, not be a dick about it. So
Yeah.
instead of like, this is my world, you can't, there's like that, to the other side of it, you can just be like, oh, to let you know, this is kind of, I don't have all the Ravnica options, because for my world, this is the setting I want to see if it lines up. It's almost like you get like a little pitch, they get a little pitch. You might even meet somewhere in the middle. So I started Gearus with, like, there are 7 common races, and it's like, the usual PHB ones, then gnomes, orcs, and goblins are also common, right? And then it's like, if you want to run a Vidalcan, first of all, ignore all the lore. Second of all, we're going to have to work together to figure out how your character fits in. And it may be that they're not a Vidalcan, they get all the Vidalcan stats, but they're like a human, So, like, it's figuring out what the player actually wants. Because a lot of times they pick weird options because they want mechanics, right? They don't actually want to play out, like, playing a weird character. They want a certain option set. Other times they just want the story of it, and you can find little ways to integrate that story, But the one thing, reflecting on it, there have been a few games I've run that have been unsatisfying, and the points of conflict really came to a change of expectations. So one of the reasons Tyranny of Dragons got a little weird in the middle there is because I let one of the players where I felt I needed to have my players experience freedom, I let my player go out and just straight up murder somebody. And as the DM, I didn't step out of the game world and say, listen, no, that's not going to help you. I don't care that's the thing you want to do. No. And then, for Monday Campaign 2, first of all, I hadn't done my homework. I didn't go into the cave and create an established world. I was always playing catch up, and I was DMing antagonistically. Like, I'm comfortable in myself to admit that. And at the same time, my players were playing antagonistically. They were doing a lot of things where we weren't meeting each other halfway. When I started running Monday D&D again, just for like coworkers and stuff, we started with a party of 6. Then it became, oh, can this person join? Can this person join? And at the time, I'm like, I'm not invested in this game, so sure. But now you have a rotating cast and nobody knows what's going on because nobody's invested. Because I wasn't invested, it gave them the space to not be invested, and the level of play decreased. Then it went like literally in 1 week from a group of 6 or 7 or 8 to a group of 3. And suddenly now it's like this campaign that I've prepped for, that prep is now inappropriate because you have so many less players now, you know, and the players, what they want to do with their characters is just so different that it became more of a game of trying to recover than it was a game of trying to press through to a satisfying experience. I started to DM in a way where I was thinking about not losing instead of winning. And that's where, and Mad Mage was the same way. Like, listening back to what I was talking about with Mad Mage, to me, Mad Mage was an unsatisfying experience because I knew what I wanted, but the players I didn't make sure that the players were on board and understood what they were getting. And largely it's kind of because I didn't really know what I was getting either. You know, Mad Mage is a very kind of hodgepodge module where you do get some story moments. You do get a lot of a downtime. There is weird things that get thrown in. And I spent most of my time trying to make one of the players happy because he was just complaining the entire time. And instead of just saying, listen, this isn't the game you want. Bye. Like, so it's one of those interesting things of like, where do you find that point where it's like, and Gearus, again, there's a lot of things I'm doing right, but that's a separate podcast for a separate day. So
as a very quick aside, I won't go too deep into this. There is a great power in being able to say no. And there's something very freeing in just saying no. I've had some players try to like jump on to certain groups here and there. Now, especially that I'm in charge of all of that. This far and no farther shall you continue. But when some people try to join up, like they'll hear from their friends, oh, I'm just having such a great time playing D&D. And then they'll be like, oh, can I join? And then the players will instead go, instead of them saying, hey, I brought a friend today without permission, I've talked to them about that stuff, they will say, go contact the DM, and I'll get a contact saying, hey, is there room? Can I jump in? Whereas in the past, when we were in a brick and mortar space, I might have said, yeah, sure. But now, no. And it's like when I hear from people that want to join up in certain campaigns, if the group is already well established, they already have a very strong rapport with each other, they've all committed to the game, we've already worked through any kinks that have come through, a new player in that scenario, some players can jump right in and roll right through it because they'll commit to the world and they'll do their due diligence and jump in. Others, so many others, don't. Or they'll kind of fight the world. And if your group is full, if you have your great number of players, you got your 5 players and they're working great, how cool is it to be able to say, no, we're full?
Yeah, so it is a really good question to ask. And that will change the story you tell yourself, which will change the system that incentivizes certain behavior. And that, you know what I mean?
Yeah. The ability to say no is not something I practiced early. When we were in Quester's Way, especially, I would say yes to whatever I could because at the time it seemed to help. But really, it was eroding my own abilities. And now that I have the opportunity to work with smaller groups and better curate a clientele, and those clientele are also friends, it also frees me from people that were very difficult to work with and would never commit to that world. They never met me in the middle. From a business end, it's a small thing, and it should grow in tiny ways because I think that D&D is a special thing that benefits from finding groups that work well together, and you need to be careful. So it's like a one more person kind of thing instead of getting 10 more people.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm going to go so far as to make this hot take. So I would go so far as to say that homebrew is inappropriate for somebody just coming in. And the reason is because they don't, and that's why D&D 101 was successful was because I ran a very blanket neutral module at the beginning. I ran Lost Minds of Phandelver, and that same group that grew up with the neutral module that learned the stuff, they were able to level up their player experiences to more of a homebrew campaign, which was Tyranny of Dragons, but it was the same group that I had ended up developing trust with. So in the Quester's Way model, like running something module based, something that where each session has a beginning, middle, end, like that I think would be, it doesn't matter then who you get. If you get someone annoying, then you can talk to them after about, hey man, you were really annoying. Like,
Yeah.
You gotta fix that, or you can't come back. Like, like that, you can weed them out through that. And then when you develop the Gray Owls, the really in-depth storytelling, the more mature themes, which again, that's when you can start to invite people to level up their experience, but it requires more investment on their part. So it's almost like you create that leveling structure of beginner, intermediate, advanced, but you always start with beginner, So
Yeah. I think that, the power of saying no allows us to curate the right group for the right people and for the right DM. It also gives us the power to be able to say no. It's that's not the experience or the expectation I'm offering. So no. And I like the idea also of running one shots from a module setting, because it helps us. I know the power to say no grants you the power to say no. Yes. Wow. Oh God. But when I have run modules, even as a business, they've been short ways to experiment. It's almost like I dare say, like an interview of certain players, of new players.
You're right. It's like an interview. It's like a first date. You're trying to get to know each other.
I'm seeing, is this an appropriate person for the deeper relationships of those deeper campaigns? If not, then maybe we have another module another time and they can jump into that one. Or maybe this is not the table for you.
No, yeah, actually, you just said something amazing, and it just made me realize sometimes the unsatisfying games I run, they're unsatisfying maybe from a narrative or an experience perspective, but it ended up being the necessary discomfort that helped create a better experience later. Like, just because you say no doesn't mean you say no to the relationship. You're saying no to a certain level, right? So like you can have a yellow belt, and if they keep failing their test, they stay at yellow belt. You still train them. Maybe they get frustrated and leave. Maybe they persevere until they figure it out. Then they pass the test to get to orange, on to the next level. But there is a certain like thinking of it through as a business thing, and as a relationship thing, and as a narrative thing. I'm starting to really, it really helps clarify the role that modules play in the overall scheme of things. That and you know what? Honestly, thinking back on it, that's why my first group imploded. They failed at the interview stage, and I didn't have the confidence of character or DMing. To me, I navigated that very unskillfully, and a reason for that was just because of a lack of experience. So I didn't present something that let them that allowed them to curate to a higher level. My Gearus, that's my black belt class right now. Everybody in that is at that black belt level where now we can get the most out of the experience, but we needed to go through the interview stage to kind of get there. And there are people that have texted me and said, "Hey man, I've heard about this Gearus game," and I'm like, you know what, it's full, sorry. And it's is it really? Kind of. Like, I bet if I had another Ian or another Adam, I could find a space for it.
Night Owls will have moments where I'll say, okay, we're full at 6, but I, as the DM, allow myself to, at any point, to say, we take in the 7th player. And often that happens. I know that there are a couple players that are very low maintenance. They can just jump in. They've already committed to the world. They know my expectations. They're ready to go. And if they're around, they'll jump in. And I know they're not going to take away from others' experiences. They've already committed to the relationship. And then there are other players that will say, oh, can I just jump in? Like, no, because I know that if I don't have the space or the time to prepare for them, then they won't have a strong experience. And after a certain point, also the numbers just they work against you. So that's why I say we are full at 6, and some games we're full at 5, and some games we're full at 4, based on the appropriateness and the party composition. It's based on the experience I want to create for those players. So lately, by it becoming so much more personal, and even in this kind of setting, I've been able to practice saying no. Whereas before, I would be fearful of that because by saying no, I hurt the business. But instead, by saying no, I help the business. I make the experience better for everyone. And I also leave the door open for another experience I can offer that might fit this person better. It doesn't mean I burn the bridge. It just means it's not appropriate at this time. And by doing that, I also preserve the experience from the other group, and I maintain that wonderful sense of trust and rapport without forcing another player in there that may not fit just because they really want to play.
In terms of player expectations and my experiences, I agree with all the things that you guys have been saying so far. And I find it interesting when you have an antagonistic DM player relationship, because I've had a player in one of my games explicitly tell me that they find joy in trying to dismantle all the things that I've set up. And it's like I'm not sure how to take that. Like it sounds like the things that I've set up are that interesting and you just want to mess with them. Or is it like, me? Like, am I the one messing up here? Like, should I be doing something differently? And they don't, like, they're not malicious or whatever, but like they're excited to see what the possibilities are in the world. That's how I look at it anyway. And it's just like I find difficulty in trying to cater to that kind of experience.
Yeah. All right. So I have two things immediately, and really what it shows on their end is an immaturity from a player perspective. They're just an immature player. It doesn't mean they're an immature person, right? But it means in their view of what becomes possible when they enter the space of D&D, they are probably used to a lot of restraints put on them, and they are they want to take advantage of the freedom because they have it. So when it comes to dismantling, especially if you play a lot of video games or a railroaded experience or board games where there are very defined rules, this is what my original goal was try to dismantle everything the DM had. It was because you have a freedom in a medium where you classically don't associate freedom. You associate choice, right? But those choices are curated for you ahead of time, so you don't have ultimate choice, So because of that, instead of recognizing the game as a vehicle to invest in, they see it as an experience of chaos. They see it as something where they can mess with the game state. They can try to dismantle. They can try to take a peek behind the curtain, because in other experiences they're unable to, and they're comfortable speaking up because they're comfortable with you as a person. So that's where the module comes in handy, because now you have a neutral thing where if they dismantle it or they break it or they feel clever for circumventing it, you don't have any investment in it. You can, and this is actually why I like that I did modules for so long. It gave me the space to let those players get that out of their system, where it was like they would really be like, oh, I just want to mess with the game. And it's like, all right, mess with this game because right now it's not mine, But once they've tired themselves of doing it, now they actually get to, it frees them to invest in your thing. So it's not that they're being railroaded or the choices are being taken away from them. It's actually the opposite. They have more choice and more impact, and their choices matter more because they've gotten out of their own way, you know? So it, when it comes to like that module thing, it's when are you ready for the next level? Well, you're not ready yet. So we'll stick to modules for right now until you're ready to invest. And you know what? That's okay. This may not be the most satisfying play for me as the DM, but it lets us do something cool together because I have the time right now, you know? So, and that's another key thing. And that's why it comes back to something we don't talk about enough, the role of scheduling in the experience, you know? Are we looking to invest 3 hours? Are we looking to go until 3 a.m? Are we all getting tired and it's better now that we kind of cut here, you know? So you don't have to make it okay for them, but there are ways that you can structure the environment so that you don't feel like you're losing out because they need to get that kind of freedom. They need to experience. It's the way I think about it is give a kid a controller for a sandbox game or like Minecraft. What do they initially do? They get overwhelmed by the freedom and they try to mess with the game as much as they can and discover, or Grand Theft Auto was kind of a similar thing. But eventually that gets boring because you end up just doing the same thing over and over again, which comes back to that chart of flow, that time over difficulty. When you're working to dismantle the game, there's no difficulty. You know, eventually you dismantle it. You've done it. You do that enough times, it becomes boring. So you seek a greater challenge. So that's when that investment comes in. So that's my 2 cents on it. Again, it's very attack, very blame oriented, I think, in terms of language. But at the same time, I do think that when you get players like that, it's kind of like the bard only seduces dragons, you know? There's just a player immaturity, but that's separate from how they are as a person, you know? They just haven't had the time to sit with the game enough.
Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts. You can find our YouTube channel that uploads videos every Sunday at 9 a.m., run mostly by John down here, but may have content soon by myself and Ian. You can also find our blog over at adamandstrakeproductions.com over at the GM's Corner, where you can find notes from The Apprentice from Ian and John's study hall from John, and then my posts from the GM's Corner official Den Master, whatever you want to call it, on Tuesdays and Saturdays with a few supplemental content. That's also where we find a lot of our Grey Owls fiction, as well as Night Owls archives and all the other adventures that we run. We might have a few other offerings there soon, but I'll keep them on the hush-hush for now. This podcast uploads every Friday on Podbean, as well as iTunes, and very soon, probably by the time this uploads, on Spotify. If you look for DM Shower Thoughts, you'll be able to find us on Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify. And please like, subscribe, and listen if you enjoy this content. This does have a crowdfunding campaign, which is done through Podbean. You can find it in the links down below, and as well as who has done our cool art. And you can find their links as well. And any other ways you want to support the show, you can find in our descriptions down below. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and please, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.